She said I was sensitive, as if she were diagnosing a rare illness, incurable and a little embarrassing. She said it rolling the word around on her tongue, with a half-smile that never reached her eyes. Lorenzo, you're too sensitive. Not attentive, not deep, sensitive. The elegant way Marta had found to tell me that, in our home, either I was made of stone or I was a problem. For years I believed it was a defect of mine, some factory flaw in my character. Then I found out why it suited her so well for me to believe that version. We were never the cute couple from the furniture commercial. Seen from the outside, our life looked like one of those flats photographed for design magazines. Warm lights, pale wood, smiling daughter, neutral paintings on the walls. Milan, a nice but not too nice neighborhood. Me, an account manager at a communication agency. Her a psychotherapist specializing in couples therapy. Already that, in hindsight, sounds like screaming irony. We met at university. She always one step ahead of everyone. The brightest in social psychology seminars. Me, the one who actually took notes and asked questions after class. At the beginning, her favorite sentence about me was a different one. I like how you notice things, Lorenzo. You're receptive. Later, that word evolved, like everything that corrupts over time. From receptive to overreactive, from deep to dramatic, and then the final branding, sensitive. The wedding was a sober event, just as she wanted. No fireworks, no karaoke, everything calibrated, everything harmonious. I remember little of the day itself, apart from her mother's hands everywhere. On the table plan, on the flowers, on the menu. Adriana, my mother-in-law, is the perfect prototype of the woman who hugs you hard, and while she squeezes you, she measures you. She'd been a primary school teacher for 40 years, used to managing children and distracted fathers. Sure, she always knew what was best for everyone. Her father, Giulio, was the opposite. A man of few words, discreet presence, a gaze that registered everything and spoke little. He was the one who sometimes threw me the half-complicit smile when the women of the house began orchestrating the world. Back then, I thought he was a silent ally. I would discover later that he was above all witness who had chosen the comfortable side of inertia. The routine built itself like dust on shelves, slow, constant, inevitable. Marta opened her office at 9, saw couples in crisis, angry women, confused men. I went to the office, presentation, clients, KPIs, strategies. In the evening, we came back to a tidy flat, made dinner, put our daughter Sophia to bed, and I pretended that the constant knot in my stomach was just tiredness. When I happened to talk about it, she would put down her spoon, look at me with the same professional calm she reserved for paying patients, and say softly, "You feel it because you're sensitive. You take everything too seriously." And I, the good student, nodded. If a psychotherapist said so, it had to be true, right? The first time I realized that word wasn't an observation, but a weapon was on a random Sunday, at lunch with her family. Long table, steaming lasagna, good red wine, brought out only when you're here too. El Lorenzo? Giulio would say, as if he hadn't repeated the same line for the last 8 years. Adriana scurried between kitchen and dining room, serving, checking portions, straightening crooked cutlery as if the balance of the solar system depended on it. Marta, next to me, smiled at her phone now and then, that smile whose every shade I knew. There was one in particular that had been bothering me for a while. The left corner of her mouth slightly higher, her eyes dropping to the screen, and no longer coming back up to me. When I saw her do that for the 4th time in less than 10 minutes, I asked, almost out of duty, "Who's messaging you so much on a Sunday?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insinuate anything. I asked the way you ask if someone needs water. The reaction, though, was disproportionate. Marta huffed, put the phone down with a theatrical gesture, and pushed her plate away. "Mom, listen to this. Lorenzo is jealous of my phone." Adriana smiled, half amused, half irritated. "Oh, Lorenzo still with these things?" Marta, "Darling, you married him because he was sensitive, but every now and then you should remind him he's not the center of the world." The table filled with light little giggles, the kind that cut more than a blade. "I was just curious," I muttered. "I didn't accuse you of anything." Marta put a hand on my arm, The touch cold. Love, I've told you 1,000 times. You're too sensitive. You read into everything. It was just a colleague from the center. We're organizing a new workshop. Breathe. Everyone rushed to change the subject, as if we just jumped over a puddle, and it was best not to look at how much water had actually splashed us. I stayed seated, fork frozen halfway. What hit me wasn't so much the sentence. I'd heard it in 1,000 variants, but the way it had been thrown into the middle of the others, like a shared diagnosis, a label displayed in public. Lorenzo, the sensitive one. No longer an intimate trait, but a family in-joke. In that moment, for the first time, instead of asking myself whether they were right, I asked myself what they gained from making me believe they were. The answer began to take shape a few weeks later, on a rainy evening. Marta had gone out for a conference. Sophia was asleep. The house floated in that dense silence I knew only too well. I was doing something she hated, sorting drawers. She couldn't stand me touching her papers, her therapeutic spaces. She said the mess helped her think, that scattered papers were like living maps. I, on the other hand, needed to see Bearwood at least once a month, to remind myself the house wasn't just a backdrop. Opening the drawer of her desk in the living room, the one where she kept her laptop when working at home, I found a yellow Post-it folded in 4. It only said, Folder, subject L/Drive. I felt my brain make that little click it makes when an insignificant detail slots into 100 other things you'd filed away as random. Subject L. Our surname is LaRusso, but no one in the house had ever called me L. I thought about her clinical cases, her supervision sessions, the stories she took to her colleagues. I thought about the generic account she gave of her sessions, a patient who, or a couple who, and then all of a sudden, I thought about how often those descriptions sounded far too much like us. Like me, I stood in front of the open laptop. The Google Drive search screen was already there, her account logged in. The cursor blinked in the search bar. It was one of those decisions you don't really make. They just happen. My fingers typed on their own, subject L. While I waited for the results to load, I heard my heartbeat in my ears, a muffled drum. I told myself I was exaggerating, that it was probably some random case, that I shouldn't be paranoid. Then the folder appeared, longitudinal research, subject L, raw data, private, date created, 8 years earlier, almost the whole length of our marriage. I clicked. Inside were subfolders ordered with almost manic precision: audio, transcripts, clinical diary, family observations, mood charts. The file names were even more precise. L, reaction to father's death 2017 audio. L, marital discussion about jealousy, transcript. L, nighttime panic attack date. Every event that, for me, had been a private earthquake, locked up in our bedroom or in my head, was there, archived, labeled, dissected. One line for everything I had, until that moment, believed was ours. I opened a file at random, clinical diary, L, year 3. The first lines knocked the air out of me even more than the sight of the list itself. Subject L, male, 34, university degree, shows marked traits of emotional hypersensitivity and a tendency to ruminate. His perception of relational dynamics is deeply influenced by unprocessed childhood abandonment patterns. In the presence of neutral stimuli, e.g. partner's phone use, lateness, family microirony, he reacts with above-average intensity, interpreting such events as personal rejection. His level of insight is high, but often used to blame himself, keeping the family system apparently intact. Hypothesis: subject highly suited to the study of living with a hypersensitive partner. I read that sentence 3 times. Highly suited to the study. I stayed there, hands hovering over the keyboard, as if moving them might make something explode. In those lines, I was no longer Lorenzo, her husband. I was the subject. A case, material, an observable phenomenon. That sensitivity she had been throwing in my face for years, the thing that made me feel defective and wrong, had become for her a goldmine of data, a career, a research project, a thesis, perhaps, a monograph in the making. I remembered a sentence she'd said a few months earlier, distractedly, while making coffee. I'm working on something big, a project that could really make a difference to couples therapy. I had smiled, proud. I had no idea that the difference, the expendable piece, was me. I kept scrolling. There were detailed transcripts of arguments I had never recorded. Pauses, sighs, my phrases quoted word for word. L, I feel that when you talk about me to your mother, you do it as if I were a difficult child, not a man. M, you're exaggerating. You're always so sensitive. L, prolonged silence. At the end of the dialogue, her clinical comments. Hypersensitive reaction to maternal feedback. Tendency to perceive coalitions even in normative contexts. Confirms hypothesis of fragile emotional structure. I realized my mother-in-law wasn't just an intrusive mother-in-law. She was a co-researcher, a mirror, a factor, an experimental variable. Adriana, the teacher who classified children, was now classifying me too, alongside her daughter. And that word thrown out at lunch in front of everyone, sensitive, wasn't just a family label. It was a clinical category of an experiment no one had asked me if I wanted to take part in. I closed my eyes. I remembered the night my father died, the way I had sat on the hospital corridor floor, my back against the cold wall, my legs giving way. Marta was there. She held my hand, stroked the back of my neck. Cry. It's important that you allow yourself to feel. She had whispered phrases that, looking back now, sounded like perfect textbook quotes. That same night, back home, she had asked if she could record something for you, because maybe it will help you hear how you talk about your father while it's fresh. I had nodded, swollen with grief and gratitude. She put her phone on the table. The two of us on the sofa, and I had talked for 40 minutes. In Drive, the file called L. Grief Processing, Acute Phase. Duration, 41 minutes and 23 seconds. I wondered how many of my tears she had experienced as a human moment, and how many as material. How many times, when she hugged me, Marta's mind was in the room with me, and how many times it was already on the page, building concepts. The thought made me feel sick, not only because of what she did, but because of how perfectly she managed to do it without ever making me doubt her. If there was a subject worth studying in that house, maybe I wasn't the only one. I didn't make a scene that night. I closed the laptop calmly, put the Post-it back exactly where I'd found it, and went to watch Sophia sleeping, clutching her teddy, her steady breathing, the mess of her brown hair on the pillow, the foot sticking out from under the blanket. I felt something very simple and very clear. If I made the wrong move, they would convince her that Dad was the problem. The sensitive, the unstable one, the too much. I could already see myself in a paragraph. Subject L's resistance phase to narrative restructuring. I couldn't allow my reaction to become one more line in her table of contents. The next day, the routine kept up its dance. Coffee. How was the conference? Good. Exhausting, but full of ideas. Sophia to take to school, emails to answer. I was calm, perhaps even calmer than usual. Marta noticed. You seemed detached. Everything all right? I felt the temptation to laugh. I'm trying not to be too sensitive, I said. She pulled a face I couldn't read. Annoyance? Suspicion? Maybe just a brief discomfort of someone who, for a moment, sees themselves in a mirror. For a few days, I did the one thing she probably never expected from me. I observed, not with my heart, my gut, as I usually did, but with the same clinical gaze she used on others. I noticed her changing rooms to reply to messages, work calls that stretched late into the evening, quick stifled giggles. I noticed how often she mentioned a certain Camilla in conversation. Supervisor, colleague, old friend, co-author of the famous project. Camilla says my case study is so rich we can make a book out of it. Camilla thinks the subject doesn't realize how valuable he is for the research. Every time she said that word, subject, I felt anger and curiosity crawl under my skin. She had never used that term with me, to my face. In front of me, I was sensitive. Behind my back, I was L. One evening, while she was doing the dishes and talking on speakerphone, I heard fragments of a conversation that were no longer vague. No, he doesn't suspect anything. Very stable in his role. Yes, the daughter is a great stabilizing factor. No, it's not ethically problematic. Camilla, don't laugh. You know very well we all observe our own homes. The difference is that I do it methodically. I put the spoon down too hard, making the glass clink. She turned, muted the call, raised an eyebrow. Everything okay? Perfect, I said. And for the first time, I smiled at her the way you smile at a patient who doesn't want to look at the wound. The first real decision I took that night, I'd copy everything. I waited for her to fall asleep, the heavy breathing of someone convinced she still has the whole scene under control, and went back to the computer. I downloaded the entire folder onto a USB stick I kept at the office. Audio, transcripts, notes, even screenshots of chats with her mother and with the famous Camilla. There was everything. Messages where she laughed about my scenes, observations on how interesting my emotional evolution was, discussions about what ethical boundaries made sense to keep. I wonder, Camilla wrote, if at some point you'll have to tell him for fairness. Marta's reply, if I tell him, I lose the subject. Heart emoji at the end. I don't know if to lighten it out of cynicism or just from habit. As the progress bar inched along, I understood this wasn't just a violation of my privacy. It was a betrayal of the minimum alliance a marriage is built on. The idea that the other, for better or worse, sees you as a person and not as a means. I had become, for her, a means to something I didn't even fully understand. And the most ironic thing was this. Every time I tried to say, I feel used, I feel watched, I feel judged, the answer had always been the same: you're sensitive. The second blow came in almost theatrical fashion. A forwarded email, a slip-up. Usually Marta checked obsessively what part of her work she showed me. But that morning, in a rush, she asked me to print a document from her account because she was late for a supervision. I opened Gmail, searched Chapter 3 draft, as she'd asked, and immediately saw the conversation was attached to. Subject, monograph, living with a highly sensitive partner. Final layout. Recipient, Camilla. In the body, a few lines. Chapter 3 is the strongest. The home as laboratory. He obviously doesn't know. Tell me if you think it's balanced enough between ethics and clinical honesty. I opened the PDF. The dedication hit me more than any concept, to L, who has taught me more than he knows. I felt the blood drain. I started reading. The chapter talked about a man in his 30s with a university degree, working in a competitive environment, who shows marked difficulty regulating emotions. There was no name, of course, but there were details no outsider could have mistaken. My father's death, our flat near the Navigli, even the fact that Sophia was afraid of the dark and slept with a moon-shaped lamp. My partner, Marta wrote, is the perfect example of how male sensitivity, if not contained and integrated, can become a constant source of tension for the family system. Every gesture is read into, every silence interpreted. Sometimes a single unexplained message is enough to trigger a whole monologue about loyalty. And then the sentence that froze me. The fact that I am a therapist allows me to observe the process through a double lens, participant and observer. Obviously, he doesn't know this. I printed that chapter with surprisingly steady hands. I felt something inside me click. It wasn't just anger. It was a change of state. As if a part of me, the one that for years had let itself be explained, justified, interpreted, had sat down and said, now it's my turn to speak. The confrontation didn't come straight away, though. Part of me wanted to run to her office, throw the printouts in her face, ask if she was recording my explosion as well. Another part. The part finally learning not to play by the script laid out for me, decided to wait for the moment when the performance would have a right audience. Marta had a big presentation 2 weeks later, a clinical psychology conference on new perspectives on sensitivity in couple relationships. She hadn't talked about anything else for days. She'd worked on the slides with manic care, practiced in front of the mirror. One evening she even asked me to listen, tell me if it flows. I watched her pacing back and forth in the living room, explaining in a confident voice how the highly sensitive partner is often perceived as heavy, but actually brings hidden cracks in the system to light. Every word was a knife she didn't realize she was twisting in me. You're nervous, she said at the end, noticing my clenched jaw. It's a lot of material. I know. More than anyone, you should understand. I only answered, yes, more than anyone. On the day of the conference, I went too. Not because I wanted to, but because she'd asked me with that false modesty that is really a request in disguise. Will you come? I'd really like to have you there. I knew that, in her narrative, I was a supporting partner, the sensitive one who ultimately approved of using his sensitivity for a higher cause. I put on a jacket, dropped Sophia off at Adriana's. Don't get worked up, Lorenzo. It's just a conference, not a trial, my mother-in-law quipped, and followed her into the hotel hall where the event was held. There were rows of chairs, a projector, a table with bottles of water. Camilla was there, elegant in a dark suit, with the look of someone who already knows she's on the right side of the story. When she saw us, she hugged Marta warmly, and me with that polite distance reserved for patients' relatives. So nice of you to come, she said. It's important for partners to take part in these moments. I smiled. I like seeing how I'm being written, I said. She laughed, thinking it was a joke. When Marta's talk started, the room went quiet. She walked onto the stage confidently. Mike clipped her jacket, slides perfectly coordinated. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about male sensitivity as a lens for understanding couple dynamics. I listened to the first 5 minutes in silence, the printed chapter in my bag, the USB stick in my inside pocket. I watched her move her hands, modulate her voice, look at the audience the way she looked at me, with that same steady calm. In my work, I've had the good fortune to closely observe a particularly rich case, she said at one point, a colorful chart projected behind her. A partner I would define as highly sensitive, whose emotional reactivity systematically illuminated the latent dynamics in his family. She never said my name, of course, but every detail she added sketched my silhouette in the air. The evenings when the subject asked for reassurance about a message, the mornings when the subject felt excluded from the mother-daughter-mother-in-law coalition, the nights when the subject had anxiety attacks. Every time she joked to the audience to lighten things, a part of me was registering faces. Colleagues, therapists, students, all listening, fascinated by the story of that distant man. None of them knew he was sitting in the third row, counting breaths to keep from throwing up. I didn't interrupt the talk. It would have been too easy for her to dismiss everything as an emotional reaction. I waited for the end, waited for the applause, waited for Camilla to hug her, for colleagues to shake her hand. I waited for the buffet, the Prosecco glasses, the olives and white dishes. And then, when the wave of congratulations had thinned out, I walked over. That was very interesting, I said calmly. Marta smiled, happy, flushed with pride. Thanks. I'm sorry if you felt exposed. I try to keep as anonymous as possible. I nodded. Oh, yes. Subject L was really hard to recognize. Her smile stayed on her lips a second too long, then slipped. How? I opened my bag, took out the printed chapter, and laid it on the high table holding the canapes. The first lines were immediately visible. She saw the title and went slightly pale. Camilla, beside her, tilted her head. Is there a problem? I looked at Camilla with a calm I didn't know I had. No problem. I was just asking Marta whether she thinks it's ethically okay to use her own husband as a clinical case without telling him. Just curious. The word ethical in that room had the same effect as a spilled drink. A few colleagues instinctively glanced our way. Camilla touched the sheet lightly, read the dedication, lifted her eyes to Marta. I told you you'd have to talk to him at some point. Marta swallowed. Lorenzo, this isn't the place. I know this isn't the place, Marta. But this is the place where you've just told half of my life as if it were a lab experiment. It felt polite to return at least a bit of transparency. I put the USB stick on the table as well. Everything's on here. Your notes, the recordings, the chats with your mother where you discuss how to handle my drama, the ones with Camilla where you ask yourself how far you can go before we become sensitive material for professional board. I paused. Sensitive. Rainy bells. Camilla had gone pale, had exchanged a quick look with Marta. A few colleagues were moving closer, drawn by the magnetic field of a looming disaster. Adriana wasn't there, but for a second I heard her ghost voice say, Lorenzo, don't make a scene. And in fact, I wasn't. I was perfectly calm. That's what scared them most. "We can talk about this at home," Marta whispered, eyes shining. "No," I replied. "Home is where you collected the data. Marta, this is where you presented them. It seems fair to rebalance things." I looked at the audience, pretending not to listen. "I just wanted to say one thing, since we're here. For years, I believed I was a problem, that I was too sensitive. I apologize for noticing hidden phones, cut-off giggles, half-finished sentences. I thought my perception was distorted, that my intuitions were fantasies. Now I see I was right almost every time, and that the word sensitive wasn't a description, it was a strategy. The more you convinced me I was exaggerating, the more room you had to observe, catalog, use." Someone coughed. A colleague muttered something about personal boundaries and supervision. Camilla tried to step in. "Lorenzo, I understand your anger, but in family therapy," I looked at her without hostility, without warmth. "She's not my therapist," I said. "She's my wife. Or at least, I thought so." I didn't know I'd married a participant observer. Marta took a step towards me. "I've always loved you, Lorenzo. That has nothing to do with this." I felt the room hold its breath. That was her speciality. Compartmentalize, keep the abstract idea of love intact while the concrete use of the other was being questioned. "I believe you," I said. "I believe that in your head you managed to hold both things together. Love and research. The problem is that the body paying the price was mine. The brain you analyzed was mine. The crying you recorded was mine. And I never signed an informed consent." They stopped me there. A moderator stepped in. Someone suggested, "Maybe it's better continue this in private." I nodded. Because I had already said the part that mattered to me, I wasn't apologizing anymore for how I felt. I was no longer accepting sensitive as an insult. I was simply showing the folder they thought they could keep hidden. The consequences were less immediate and slower than you'd expect from a scene like that. The professional board opened an anonymous inquiry into a possible ethical violation. No one ever officially said Marta's name, but word began to spread. Some colleagues distanced themselves. Others whispered that deep down we all do it. We all observe our own lives. Others did what people do best in the face of ambiguity. They looked away. Meanwhile, at home, the walls started to creak. The first to react was Adriana. She wasn't used to seeing her daughter at the center of the problem. The family story always featured a man in something messing up. Inadequate, absent, unfaithful. When Marta told her, in a conveniently softened version, that I had ruined her conference, Adriana called me. "Lorenzo, was it really necessary to humiliate her in front of everyone?" I listened in silence, then answered with that same new calm. "For years, you dissected every reaction I've had, calling it exaggeration. None of you ever found it humiliating to tell my breakdowns to colleagues and supervisors. This time it was your version that got put under the spotlight. I imagine it hurts." She sighed and pulled out the same old weapon. "You see? You're always the one who feels too much." I smiled, almost tenderly. "No," I replied. "I'm just the one who feels. Full stop. The difference is that I no longer let you use that too much to shut me up." With Sophia, it was more complicated, because she is the only person in this whole story who hadn't chosen any of it. She was 8, old enough to sense something was shifting, too young to understand what. Marta told her that Dad is angry with Mom because of her work. I told her that Mom did something that hurt me, and now we have to figure out how to fix things. There is no elegant way to explain to a child that one of the people she loves used the other as a character in a book. There's only truth broken into small, digestible pieces. What I knew was that I was not going to let Sophia grow up believing that if she feels something, the problem is hers. Marta, in the meantime, oscillated between guilt and defense. There were nights when she cried and said she'd made a mistake, that she'd been carried away, that her intention had been to help other couples through our experience. There were mornings when, in her usual professional voice, she explained to me that my reaction was also interesting from a clinical point of view. Every time she used the word clinical talking about us, I felt the distance between our shores widen. "You really can't step out of the role, can you?" I said one day. Even when you're trying to apologize, you talk as if you were taking notes on me. She snapped, "That's how I function. I can't switch it off." "I'm not asking you to switch it off." I replied, "I'm asking you not to turn on me." The following months were a slow autopsy of marriage that, honestly, might have died long before. While she tried to salvage her professional reputation, I started therapy of my own, with someone who didn't know her, who had never heard my name as Subject L. It was almost comical, sitting in front of another therapist and saying I'd married one. "That must have been interesting," she said, with that cautious irony that leaves room for you to say whether it was heaven or hell. "It was convenient," I replied. Every time I had a feeling, there was already a label ready. I didn't even have to make the effort to understand it myself. "And now," she asked, "now I'm trying to figure out who I am without footnotes." The separation came not as an explosion, but as a document, after yet another argument where everything boiled down to, we can't go back from what we discovered about each other. We decided that living together in that lab house had become unsustainable. Marta proposed a conscious uncoupling, full of terminology that made my skin crawl. I signed the agreements with steady hands, thinking only of how to protect Sophia. I didn't want to take her mother away, didn't want to turn her into a judge of a story she hadn't asked to see. We set times, days, schools, shared birthday parties. We can be an example of a healthy separation. Marta said the last time we spoke as husband and wife. Maybe I'll write another chapter about it. I looked at her, tilted my head. "Just don't call it Subject L, follow up, please," I said. She didn't laugh. The new beginning was less epic than motivational stories make it sound. I didn't move cities, didn't start a company, didn't enroll in a mountain yoga retreat. I rented a small 2-room flat on a side street, bought furniture I could afford, made sure Sophia's bedroom was the most cared-for room in the place. I opened boxes of memories that had never found a place in the harmonious flat where everything had to be neutral. Crooked photos, books with notes in the margins, the scratched record I used to listen to with my father. I hung things on the walls that Marta hadn't liked. A painting that was too dark, a print that was too ironic, a poster of an old film. I built, piece by piece, a place that didn't look like a set. The hardest part was learning to use that word, sensitive, without feeling dirty. For a while, every time someone used it, at work, in therapy, even in conversations with friends, I felt the reflex to defend myself. It's not a flaw, I told myself, but it sounded like an automatic reaction, an empty mantra. Over time, in the silence of my flat and in slow conversations with my therapist, I began to see it through a less moralistic lens. The problem wasn't that I felt a lot. The problem was that, in that house, my ability to feel had become a tool in the hands of those who wanted to keep control of the narrative. For Marta, for Adriana, it was convenient to find me as too sensitive. It meant that every time my perception caught something true, a lie, a manipulation, an ambiguity, all they had to do was say you're exaggerating, and the system stayed intact. With Sophia, I chose a different path. When she said, "I got angry because the teacher didn't look at me," I didn't answer "you're sensitive." I asked, "What exactly did you feel?" And I listened, without correcting her immediate experience with a label. It's incredible how your inner posture changes when you stop thinking your sensitivity is a problem to fix and treat it as a sensor to calibrate. It doesn't become less intense, but it stops being something that's easy to mock. I haven't seen Camilla again. Now and then her name pops up in some article shared on social media, some event about conscious relationships. Marta is still working, even though her monograph has suffered an indefinite delay. I don't know if she will change the chapter about me, if she'll rewrite it removing details, if she'll cut me out entirely. Maybe one day I'll find a nicely laid out book on the subject in a bookshop and wonder how much of me lives under a fake name. I don't even know whether at night, when she turns over in bed in a house without me, she thinks back to the Subject L folder with fondness or remorse. It's no longer my business. What I do know is that, as far as I'm concerned, I've closed my own folder on her, not in the sense of forgetting, but in the sense of no longer trying to explain, justify, interpret every past gesture in the light of what I've discovered. There's a point beyond which analysis becomes just another way of staying stuck. And ironically, it's my sensitivity that told me when it was time to stop looking at the file and start looking at life. Sometimes, in the evening, when Sophia is with me and falls asleep on the sofa watching cartoons, I find myself looking at her with an almost painful tenderness. I think about all the stories she'll tell one day about us, about me and her mother, about our fights, our attempts, our failures. I think about how she will use words. I only hope she learns to distrust people who use "you're too sensitive" to close a conversation instead of opening it. That she understands that feeling things pass through you is not a fault, but a risk. And that the real problem, if anything, isn't feeling. It's the ones who exploit what you feel to write their own version of events on top of it. The truth is she was right about one thing. I am sensitive. I always have been. I see micro-expressions, notice shifts in tone, pick up details others skip over. For years, that was the knife I used to cut myself with, because every time I tried to share what I saw, it came back to me as exaggeration. Now I've realized that same blade can become something else. It can be the scalpel I use to separate what I feel from what others want me to feel. It can be the tool I use to protect myself. No longer the body everyone experiments on. If there's one thing I've learned after all this, it's that the people who are truly afraid of sensitivity aren't the ones who feel too much, but the ones whose lives depend on never being seen for what they are. Marta didn't call me sensitive because she wanted to help me suffer less. She said it because every time I noticed a crack in her perfect facade, she felt naked. And nothing is more frightening for someone who builds their identity on control than having someone beside them who simply feels when something doesn't add up. She said I was sensitive, as if she were doing me a favor by reminding me of my limits. It took me years to realize that the favor I was doing for myself was every time I didn't stop perceiving, despite everything. In the end, I didn't stop. I just stopped apologizing for it. And if today I had to choose a sentence to describe myself, I wouldn't say I'm too sensitive anymore. I'd say with a new calm, I feel clearly, and that, for anyone who has something to hide, has always been the real problem.